Welcome everyone to our Lunch with the Friends program. I'm Chris Knopp, the Executive Director of Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. And today we have a really exciting program. We have a conversation with Alex Kotlowitz. He's an author, journalist, storyteller, and lover of the Boundary Waters. I feel really honored. He's been one of my heroes in the author context, and it's great to have this conversation that we can share with all of you. Alex's work is so powerful. He chronicles people at the margins of society, focusing on race, poverty, and violence. I read his seminal work, There Are No Children Here, over 30 years ago. And he bookended that with his powerful chronicle examining those similar themes of race, poverty, and violence in An American Summer. Alex first came to the Boundary Waters nearly 50 years ago in 1975, and he's returned almost every year since then. Despite being a city boy, Alex feels most at home being in the Boundary Waters, traveling by canoe and on the water. Fast forward from 30 years ago, or over 30 years ago, to 2019, I read Alex's article in New Yorker about the Boundary Waters, in which he described his love of the Boundary Waters and explained the threats posed to the Boundary Waters by the proposed Twin Metals mine. And I was just really struck. Wow, this is this amazing journalist, storyteller who has this juxtaposition here of dealing with these really powerful, heavy topics of race, poverty, and violence in an urban setting, and yet this sort of love and eloquence in his description of the Boundary Waters. So it's both in some ways jarring and difficult for me to reconcile how these two connect. And I reached out to Alex last year after his audio diary appeared on the New Yorker Radio Hour, and we got together in Chicago and had a great conversation about Boundary Waters, about his work, and I wanted to continue that conversation with Alex. And when I think of some of the words that describe what I see our connectivity tissue between his writings and heavy topics that he deals with in the Boundary Waters, I think of the words of empathy, community, and listening, and we can kind of explore that during our conversation here. And I want to invite all of you to be part of this conversation, and you can participate in this at the bottom of your screen there, the chat function and the Q&A function. So please put your comments in there and put your questions in the Q&A tab as well. And if you want to put it in the comments there where you're from, you know, how many times you've been to the Boundary Waters, we appreciate hearing that as well. So Alex, welcome to Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. I'd like to begin our conversation by talking a little bit about your background here and how where you grew up and how in your connection to the Boundary Waters.
Yeah, so Chris, as you know, I'm a city boy at heart. I grew up in New York City in Manhattan, and of course now for the last 40 years I've lived in Chicago, and I love city life. I mean, it's exciting, it's exhilarating, it's messy, it's all the things you can imagine. And for me, especially Chicago, is this place where you can see all the fissures in the American landscape around race and class, the intersection of politics and money. But as you say, my heart is up north on the water. And I came to the Boundary Waters, it was 1975. I had dropped out of college for a while. I thought I wanted to be a biologist and took organic chemistry, and I realized I was not cut out for the sciences. And so I ended up dropping out. I ended up working as a community organizer for close to a year in Atlanta. And it was a kind of, though I didn't realize it at the time, it was a transformative experience. I was working on the south side of the city in what was then the second poorest census tract in the country, working a lot with kids. And I thought I was pretty savvy about urban poverty. And I realized how little, in fact, I really knew. And it was an exhilarating but also exhausting experience. And when I ended up leaving after 8 months with the intention of returning to college. I made a detour. I had an old friend from New York who went to Carleton College, and he and I were big bicyclists, and so we decided to bike from Minneapolis to Duluth. And we did, and when we got to Duluth, we ended up going up Highway 61 and ended up on the Gunflint Trail. And I don't have a clear memory about how we ended up in the Boundary Waters, but I do remember we found an outfitter and we spent 3 days paddling, and I was smitten. I thought, this is where I belong, and so I kept coming back, and I've been coming back, pretty much every summer since.
Great. When Alex, when you say you were a community organizer, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to be a community organizer?
So we worked. It was in the 1970s. It was at the height of what was in this movement among welfare rights, welfare recipients, and so I worked with the welfare rights organization in Atlanta. We were lobbying the state legislature, and I was working, as I said, a lot with kids in the neighborhood, mentoring them, creating programs for them. And I don't think I realized, I mean, it was transformative. I realized too, I was not cut out to be a community organizer. It's not my bailiwick. Public policy, as important as it is, and I know much of my work kind of touches on it, it's not my strength. I don't have a lot of patience for it. But boy, did I learned so much from the people I spent time with there.
Great. So after that experience and graduating from college, you moved into journalism, and maybe you could talk about some of your first experiences in journalism.
Right. So I went to college. I ended up working, left college. I've been a lost soul numerous times along the way. And so I ended up working on a cattle ranch for a year out in Central Oregon. And after that, after we rounded up the cattle, I saw an ad in Mother Jones for an associate editor at a small alternative newspaper in Lansing, Michigan. And it was at a time when the alternative press was really robust and vibrant, and this was a paper that had been created by some former students at Michigan State. And so I ended up taking the job, and it was there really quickly that I learned this is what I want to do. I mean, for me, it's sort of the thing I loved about it is, on the one hand, it kind of pushed me to spend time with people who I otherwise would never have reason to meet. And it kind of gave me license to talk to people. And then the flip side of it is that once I was done with that, I could go to my office or spend my time in my house just crafting a story, just working by myself. And so it spoke to both my needs, which is both to be alone and to be amongst people. And so I realized very quickly this is what I wanted to do. I only lasted 8 months. It's the only place I've been where I didn't get along with the editor. And I got fired or quit, depending who you ask. And I ended up spending the next 4 years freelancing in Michigan. I did a lot of work for NPR, which is where I sort of learned radio. And I worked a lot with Michael Moore when he was publishing the Flint Voice up in Flint. And I will also say, when I was in Michigan, I discovered the Upper Peninsula, which I also fell in love with. A kind of very different kind of area than the Boundary Waters, but equally enthralling. So,
what was it like to work with Michael Moore back then, Alex?
It was great. I mean, he was publishing this paper in Flint. Michael and I are very different people, but I so admired him. I'd go crash with him when I went up there. And the thing I admired about Michael, and you see it in his movies, is he's irreverent. He's willing to take people on, and I just really admired that. And it was in the late 70s, early 80s, and it was a time when Flint was really distressed, really suffering. And so it was a city that really won my heart in many ways, because people were just, despite all that was going on around them, were just finding ways to persevere. but I love that work there, and I spent those 4 years there, and then I moved to Chicago, really to work for NPR. I couldn't get any daily newspaper to hire me because I had no daily newspaper experiences, which is why I wanted them to hire me. So I kind of threw my hands up and I moved to Chicago to continue my freelance work for NPR. And the last paper I applied to was the Wall Street Journal. And of all the places, that was the one paper that decided to take a gamble on me. And I thought I'd be there for a couple of years. I ended up 10 years at the paper, and it was honestly as glorious a job as one could ask for in journalism. I wrote for the front page. I would go out and spend a month or two reporting, come back and write, and then disappear again. And nobody asked very many questions about where I was. So
Well, I was going to ask you how the culture was different from working with the Flint Voice and the Wall Street Journal, but it sounds like you had pretty much free reign in both places.
Yeah, and also, the Journal at the time, the editorial pages then and now were to the right of Attila the Hun. But there was a real strong separation of church and state at the paper, and it was a real reporter's paper. They let you do, and I was there at a time when all these other writers there. I mean, Geraldine Brooks, Tony Horowitz, Jim Stewart, Brian Burrow, Susan Faludi. It was Eric Larson. It was just an amazing cast of characters. The paper was just sort of operating on all cylinders.
How exciting there. And then around that time, either as you were leaving the Wall Street Journal, or maybe when you were still there, you became enmeshed in what became There Are No Children Here. Talk about that experience there.
Yeah, well, it was directly related to my work in Atlanta. I was at the Wall Street Journal, and I wanted to go back to Atlanta to write about some of the kids that I had worked with. It had at that point been a little over 10 years, and it wasn't practically possible. And so I ended up going to a neighborhood that felt comparable to what the community I spent time with in Atlanta. And it was the projects, on the near west side of the Henry Horner homes. And I got to say, I still remember that first day in the projects. I was really knocked off balance, really deeply unsettled. I thought, they were literally a mile from my office, which was then downtown. And I just said, how is it I couldn't know? How is it I don't know about the conditions in this place? And so it was there that I met the older of the two boys, Lafayette, and I ended up doing a story for the Journal, and that ultimately led to the writing of There Are No Children Here, where I spent 2 years virtually every day in the projects with Lafayette and his brother Pharaoh, trying to understand what it meant to be growing up in a community like this. And to say the community was neglected feels too benign, because I think in many ways what happened there, if not intentional, was done with complete knowledge of what was taking place, and that was also what was so disturbing.
In that situation there, maybe you want to talk a little bit about, you're talking to say it was neglect doesn't really constitute it. Maybe what you want to talk about the systemic nature of it, and who was operating the not just the Henry Horner homes, but the whole public housing system in Chicago was quite a fiefdom back then.
So public housing was created. It was this really kind of grandiose, bold, audacious effort to provide housing for people in need. The original head of one of the original heads of the Chicago Housing Authority was this woman, Elizabeth Wood, very progressive. And it was this notion that it was going to provide housing for those who had no shelter. And it was, in some ways, I think what this country does at its best, which is, as you sort of alluded to earlier, which is this sense of community, right? If the community isn't doing all right, neither am I. And so what can I do to ensure that everybody's okay? And that was what public housing was about. But that quickly changed, it having everything to do with race. Originally, much of public housing was from returning veterans from World War II. And then when it became clear that many of the people in need were many of the Black migrants who had come up from the South, there was this in the 1950s, the city decided to build these high rises, these big community of high rises, and the white aldermen, the white city council members in Chicago, didn't want them built in their neighborhoods. And so as a result, they built them at the edge of already existing Black ghettos, and they served as a kind of bulwark to segregation. And what's more, they were built on the cheap. When I went to Henry Horner, one of the first things that was so striking is you go into I grew up in a high rise in New York, and I walked into this high rise, and the first thing you realize is there's no lobby to speak of. It's just a vestibule that cuts through the building. And, we have really cold winters here, like you do in Minneapolis. And so everything was exposed to the elements. The elevators weren't working. The lights were out in the buildings. The heating was out of control. There were these terrible smells emanating from the basements. But you also realize that, they were built on the cheap. They were naked white cinder block. There were heating pipes. And I remember one of the stories that I learned about when I was working on There Are No Children Here is when they were finished, a group of architects from the then Soviet Union came to look at them, and they were a little dumbfounded. They couldn't understand why they were being toward these projects that they told were completed when in fact they seemed incomplete. They thought, well, they can't be finished already, and of course they were. And then they were managed by a gentleman, Charlie Swibel, who for 20 years really used it as his own political fiefdom. He just provided jobs to friends and family and political cronies, people who really did not care about the well-being of the residents in these buildings. And so it's no surprise that, things quickly deteriorated. The other thing unrelated to all this is that initially the idea was that it would provide housing for people in need, and so income wasn't necessarily a factor, but at some point the federal government determined that if your rent was a certain percentage of your income, you could no longer live there. And so it ended up housing the very poor, this kind of concentration of people who were without employment, without resources, completely isolated, physically and spiritually isolated from the rest of the city. And so they ended up becoming these places that I think places of distress, places of despair. I mean, there was community, people watched out for each other. But for me, it was just incredibly distressing. And I remember those first weeks and months in the projects. And again, for myself, I was kind of angry at myself, like, how the hell couldn't I know about this?
Alex, you focused on two brothers, Lafayette and Pharaoh, in the book, and you developed a particularly close relationship with the younger, the two, Pharaoh. And in your writing, what's so powerful about your writing is that you're so granular and you humanize people and understand them as full human beings in all dimensions. And talk about how your relationship with Pharaoh evolved and what that became to you.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I want to back up for a moment because it does occur to me as I'm thinking about this. It's and this may be my own naivete, but I do feel like there's this power in storytelling, and I feel like, and this is where my naivete may come in, is if people could only see what I see, that they'll get it. And so I certainly felt that about writing about this community in Chicago. And I certainly feel, and we can talk more about this later, about writing about the boundary waters. So if people could see what I see and feel what I feel, they'd get it. They wouldn't come up here and want to mine and ultimately or possibly destroy this area of Gratitude. Yeah, I got very close to both boys in the book, and Pharaoh was, I don't really talk much about my friendship only because I feel like they were so open and willing, at this kind of tender age to share their stories with me. And I've sort of made this agreement with myself that as they get older, that it's not my place to tell their stories. And I hope at some point they will share their stories, but I'm still very much in touch with both of them. In fact, sadly, one of the boys in the book, James Howard, James Cox is his real name. I call him James Howard in the book, who was very close to Lafayette and Pharaoh, and who I was very close to, just was killed last week. He's 49 years old, and his funeral is Friday. And it just, it speaks to the kind of stubborn, persistent, unrelentless violence that we see in the city, related everything to race and class. But yeah, I'm still very, very close to the boys, and still very close to some of the others in the book as well. In fact, I used to take Lafayette and Pharaoh and James every summer up to the Upper Peninsula to go fishing. I think a canoe trip might have been asking too much of them, but
How do they respond to that experience up in the UP there?
I think they loved it. I mean, it was scary. Again, for all the reasons you can imagine, that they were accustomed to. They knew this one community really well, and I think the quietness of the place unnerved them. I also think too, we were talking a little bit about this before, but I think one of the things that was clear to me is, many of these kids, if not all of them, suffered from trauma. They had really difficult memories that they really tried to keep at bay. And one of the ways they did this was just to sort of keep really busy. I mean, it had the quality of, you saw kids and you think, oh my God, all these kids have ADHD. But I think really what was going on is they just wanted to keep busy, to keep these memories at bay. And of course, we go up to the Upper Peninsula and we've got this time and space, and they start flooding back. They start interfering with your thoughts, start interfering with your kind of everyday activities. And I think that was hard as well. But I think they loved it. It was just, it was, I mean, I know I did. I have very fond memories of that time. So.
Great. The sort of bookend to their No Children here is your more recent An American Summer here, and it's 14 stories throughout this the typical Chicago summer. It happened to be the year 2013 here, and one of the stories that is really powerful, that was also part of the This American Life series on Harper High School, was about Thomas, and talk about Thomas and what.
Yeah, when I think about Thomas's story, I think about it as a story of Thomas and his social worker Anita, Stewart, because Thomas was when I met him, he was a junior at Harper High School in the South Side, and he had been witness, I think, at that point to 3 murders. I mean, by that time, I ended up writing about him with a book, and that had increased quite a bit. Somewhat unusual experience. It's not atypical to find kids who've been experienced a number of shootings or murders, but Thomas just seemed to be there all the time. And he was a kid who I think was really, understandably, really angry and agitated, and felt very alone. And the one person who he leaned on, the one person who he trusted, was a social worker in his high school, Anita Stewart. And had it not been for Anita, I think Thomas might not be with us. I think Anita just really kind of just embraced Thomas. And what was remarkable to me is their relationship continued long after Thomas graduated from high school and long after Anita worked at Harper High. And they're still very close to this day. And I think Thomas's story is the story of so many of these kids who, again, have experienced this trauma, who don't know what to do with the memories, don't know what to do with the experiences, don't know where to and how to grieve and mourn, and feel incredibly alone. I mean, that's the thing for me. That's the thing that just sort of runs throughout all the people that I've met in communities like the ones I've written about in Chicago, is just this sense of feeling this of being on your own, that nobody could possibly understand.
And also not heard, right? That no one's listening to them and kind of listening to their story.
Right. And maybe that's goes hand in hand. It's not that I think that they feel a compulsion to tell their stories, but a feeling, again, that nobody cares, I suppose, but that nobody could possibly understand what they've been through. And so, yeah, I think there's an incredible sense of isolation.
Yeah, there was another story in An American Summer here with Lisa Daniels, and if you talk about her and what powerful thing that she did.
Lisa Daniels is a remarkable woman. So Lisa lived on the south side of Chicago, and she was raising two sons on her own. One of her sons, really terrifically smart kid, ended up going to the University of Illinois and studying engineering, and her other son ended up getting involved in drugs, and when he was in his early 20s, Darren ended up getting killed in a shootout and a drug deal gone awry, and they very quickly caught the offender. And Lisa, when they went to court, when they went to trial, at one point the state's attorney, the prosecutor, comes to Lisa and says, we think we're going to offer a plea deal to the offender, because we don't feel on particularly solid ground, because some of the witnesses all have criminal records. And Lisa was kind of really knocked off balance, and they were kind of asking for her approval. And Lisa said, I need a night to think about this. And she did, and she came back and said, I think it's okay to offer him a plea deal. The only thing I ask is that I be allowed to speak at his sentencing, which she would have been allowed to anyway. So they ended up giving this offender a plea deal. He ended up getting sentenced he pleaded guilty. And then Lisa Daniels goes to court. And in this remarkable moment, she goes there, makes some notes before she goes into court, and gives this incredibly powerful speech in the courtroom about forgiveness, about grace, and ends up in the end forgiving the young man who killed her son, and asks the judge for leniency, and they end up giving him 15 years in prison. And Lisa and the offender stayed in touch for a number of years. Lisa's just this remarkable woman, and after the book came out, she ended up getting appointed to the Illinois Parole Board, which is this institution which is all about grace and forgiveness. And I think she had a terrific impact on the people sitting on that parole board. And this is what I love about my work, Chris, is I get to meet people like Lisa or Anita or Thomas or Lafayette and Farrow. My life and my family's life feels so much richer for
that. Right. That in your writings, you're meeting people from all different backgrounds, all different socioeconomic levels, and maybe talk a little bit about your craft of writing, how you what's powerful about your writing. It's not sanitized. It's not as superficial. It's deep and meaningful and powerful. And well, how do you get to that? How do you get to that depth?
Yeah, it's I can be pretty, as my wife likes to say, I can be like a rock in a river, that I can be quite stubborn and persistent. I remind her that rocks and rivers actually change over time. But I, spend a lot of time with people. And, in the case of There Are No Children Here, I was with the boys virtually every day for 2 years. For somebody like Lisa Daniels, I'm going back and back and back and back again, interviewing her about her experience, and talking to, asking her for people in her life who I can talk to. Partly is I want to get as intimate as I can, and the other part of me is that I want to get it right. And by right, I mean both factually, but also kind of emotionally and spiritually right. I sometimes think of it as a collaborative experience, but I say that somewhat hesitantly, because I recognize in the end that I'm the one who's kind of crafting the narrative, crafting the story. But I do try, and I fail at times, try to run by everything I've written by the people I've written about to make sure that I've gotten it right. For me, in the end, it's all about story. It's all about narrative. Like There Are No Children Here. Look, I knew this is back in I was working on it in the 1980s during the Reagan years, and I knew that people didn't care. That was why I was writing about this. People had completely turned their heads away from this, and I thought to myself, how do I get people to pay attention? And so I thought, first of all, well, I need to write about the kids, because whatever you can say about the kids, they're innocent of their situation. They're not there by choice. And then I knew too that I just needed to craft a story, that if I could write a story that felt compelling and intimate, get as close as I could to writing fiction, or feeling like it was, or read like fiction, that once I got readers in, I could then get them to sort of begin to wrestle with all that I contended with and the people I've written about have contended with. And so for me, it's all about story, all about narrative.
And Alex, when you're, putting that story together, and how do you, that line between being empathetic and real and not being just voyeuristic, kind of plopping in, how do you not be voyeuristic and just sort of plop in?
Well, I feel like this is where I feel, and again, I want to be careful about using the word collaboration, because again, it's a little disingenuous, because I'm the one in the end who's got the sort of power to, when he's telling the story. But I try as best I can to work with the people I'm writing about. And the other thing that's really important to me, and again, I fail on occasion, is to be as open and honest with people about what I'm doing, so that there are no surprises. And I try to be open and honest with people, both about sort of how I think of this story, how I'm operate, about the fact that I need to talk to other people, I may need to check documentation, and sort of, and I feel like that's really essential. I mean, I'm asking them to trust me, and so I feel like it's really incumbent in that context that I really be as open and straight with people about my intent and what I'm doing.
Great. Kind of bridging the Chicago and the Boundary Waters. We have someone dropped into the comments here that she was worked as a social worker for 40 years and took 5 years out to work at Outward Bound in the Boundary Waters there, and her mother went to Harper as well. So there's the sort of another part of that connection there. And Katie here writes that the juxtaposition of urban and wilderness might seem odd to others, but both feed my soul and perhaps yours. And maybe you want to pull on that thread a bit there, Alex, about having your soul filled by both the city and the wilderness.
Yeah, well, as I said, I love city life. My wife and I we raised our kids in a suburb just west of the city. As soon as our kids were graduated from high school, we moved back into the city, and it's, I just love, again, the excitement, the exhilaration, the messy vitalities of city life. But it's also stressful, and these are incredibly stressful times, and I find peace on the water. There's so much to be said about a place like the Boundary Waters, but I mean, for me, one of the things is first of all, there's no cell service, so we're completely off the grid, and I love that. People are always amazed, you don't have any cell service at all, and I just said no, and it's the beauty of being up there, of course, and then the quietness, and there is something incredibly existential about tripping, canoe tripping. I don't want to be clear about the kind of tripping I'm talking about, but canoe tripping, because you're so in the moment. You're paddling, you're portaging, you're setting up camp, you're cooking, and it's not as if you're just sitting around on the beach, and it's one of the things I love about it, but you're just so in the moment. You don't have time to worry about what's just preceded you, and you don't have time to really worry about the next day. It is what it is. The weather, we don't bring up we bring up garments now, but we don't check the weather. And so the weather is what, you wake up in the morning, you got a wind in your face, you just deal with it, and it's just what I love about being up there.
Well, So your first trip in 1975, you rode your bikes from the Twin Cities up to Duluth, and then up Highway 61, and then up the Gunflint Trail. Found an outfitter, got out a few days, and what are some of the other trips you've taken up there, Alex? Obviously, you've been going there nearly 50 years, so you have a lot of trips.
Right. So to go to the 50 years, it was a period when I did I think I mentioned to you, did a fair amount of whitewater canoeing up in Canada.
Yeah.
That was back, I don't think I'm quite capable of doing that anymore. But, one of the areas, well, we kind of, I go up every year, or at least for one trip, sometimes two. And every year we switch from the Gunflint to Ely. And so one of my favorite parts of the waters in the far west region, which is you go on the little Indian Sioux up through Slim, and then you can go into these lakes up there, Thumb and Finger, and they're really isolated. In fact, it's the one place where I've heard wolves, which is on Finger Lake when I was up there. And I just love that area. I love all the small lakes. The fishing's really good, and you don't see a lot of people. And then, off the Gunflint, a very kind of different terrain, and certainly very different fishing. But I love the Little Sag, which is just this beautiful lake filled with islands. And again, not very populated. And then, of course, you turned me on to Crooked Lake, where we went last year up through Lake Mudrow, and I think we're going to go back up there again next year, because I felt we just got a small taste of Crooked, but that was just beautiful up there. And again, the Boundary Waters, since COVID, they've gotten more crowded. It's all relative, of course, but it's gotten more crowded. And so that first perimeter of lakes are pretty, we've had a tough time the past few years getting campsites that first night. We've had to really paddle hard. But then once you're out of that first perimeter, it feels like it's what it's always been, which is a place where you don't see a lot of people. And I just, when we were on Crooked, I think we went a day or two without seeing another paddler, which is pretty nice.
Yeah. So when talking about some of the power of silence that you experience up there in the quiet, you in some of your writings you've referenced Sig Olson. Would you talk a little bit what Sig Olson means to you? I know you're a great reader as well as a writer.
Yeah, I mean, I love Sig Olson's work. I'm going to be sacrilege. I'm not a big fan. His work is very poetic and very lyrical, and it's one of the things I wrestle with in writing about the outdoors, about the wild, is he doesn't really tell stories, and so his work is the kind of work that you can kind of dip in and out of, and there are parts of it that I love, and I would like to write more, if not about the Boundary Waters, at least about sort of the wilderness and what it means to us and what it means to our kind of sense of being human. And so I look at writers really like Terry Tempest Williams, who's just this. First of all, she's a naturalist, so she sort of understands the outdoors better than most, in this really intimate way. But she's also this beautiful storyteller, and a poet. But I know it's probably about Sig Olson. It's hard to. I kind of dip in and out of his work.
No, I know that his writing, there's a certain sensibility that works for some people, and it doesn't. And his writing, it took him a long time to get to penetrate the market, because he wasn't in that sort of adventure mode type of writing that of the 40s or so, and he kind of carved his little niche, and obviously it has great resonance for a lot of people, but it's a different, it's something a bit different too.
And the tricky thing, I think, about writing about the wilderness or writing about a place like the Boundary Waters is it's one thing to be able to write for people who have experienced it, and that's sort of Sig Olson's audience, I think, is people who have experienced this. It's another thing to try to write for people who've never experienced it, never think that they want to experience it. and to sort of draw them in. It's the same with, again, like kind of what I was up against with There Are No Children here. How do I write for people who don't care about the projects, haven't spent any time in this place? How do you get them to turn their head?
Right, right. And I mean, when you wrote about, say, there was a Sig Olson quote about the power of silence in your New Yorker story here. And I called it out here, but it's I'll just kind of read what you quoted here, that and this is the moment before dawn. It was a time of quiet, no wind rustling the leaves, no lapping of the water, no calling of animals or birds, but I listened just the same, straining with all my faculties towards something. I knew not what, trying to catch the meanings that were there in the moment before the lifting of the dark. And when I read that, it's capturing something at once. There's a lot going on, and yet there's nothing going on too.
Right.
And so it's really powerful to write about the simplicity of quiet and the power of absence, really of things.
Right. No, look, the quietude of a place like the Boundary Waters is partly what I find so alluring about the place. But having said that, I mean, you and I were talking about this earlier, is we were talking about whether either of us have taken solo trips, and I've only done it once, and it wasn't to the Boundary Waters. And the reason I don't have any inclination to do it is I feel like I spend all this time when I'm here in Chicago, kind of living in my head. I'm out talking to people, but I'm also home here at my desk writing. And so kind of the last thing I need is to go up and just spend all this time again living in my head. And one of the things I love about my trips is going up with friends and just spending time with them and sharing the experience with them. And I gotta say, it's not like we talk about much of anything. It's, I mean, occasionally if I'm on a trip with just one other person, we might talk about family and personal concerns and anxieties, but for the most part, it's just spending time with people in this kind of quietude, which I love.
Yeah, Alex, I agree. I much prefer having a community, creating community in that sense on the trip, a small community, and having that interaction and a shared experience. It's one thing to have it's solo, but it's so powerful to share it in the moment with friends.
Right. And again, it's not like we share it. I remember one of the stories I always think about is one summer I went up with a friend who had been the charge d'affaires, the kind of acting ambassador to China. And he was there in that first year of Trump, and when Trump had pulled out of the climate accord. And Dave, this was very public, so I'm not disclosing anything. Dave ended up very publicly quitting his position, left the State Department after a lifelong career there. And so I thought, and he joined us, and he needed a respite, he needed a place of refuge. And I thought, oh, great, this is gonna be great. Dave's gonna give us all this good stuff about what went on, during this time, about resigning. And of course, it became clear Dave didn't really want to talk about that. And I understand, he wanted just to sort of experience this, it was his refuge. And then I realized, you know what, I'm not sure that I really even want to hear about it up here. I just sort of want to experience this. I don't know if I want to worry about China and Trump and the climate accord. I'll worry about that when I get back. And so that's the beauty of these things.
Right. You wanted to talk about more important things like catching trout or
Right.
setting up the tent or things like
where were you
that
tonight? Are you going to cook, or it's
Well, that's the powerful of the outdoor experiences. It simplifies everything, and the sort of complexity of everyday life, and things that we think are so important in everyday life kind of fall away, and you can have that just concentration of energy on some things that are very basic yet so powerful.
Yeah.
And so maybe you could talk about a couple of your memorable experiences in the Boundary Waters, or things that when people say, "Oh, what tell me, Alex, what do you remember? What comes to mind, Alex?"
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the beauties of being up there is that every trip feels different to me. But when I get home and try to tell my wife or friends, it all begins to run together. It's just I mean, each trip, the texture of each trip feels different. It feels different because of the people I'm with, because of where I'm at, because of the weather. I've had some experiences up there that, one experience I went up with a friend, and it was late September, and I had actually was planning this trip with another friend who had some heart problems the last week of September. He bowed out, and so I found a friend who was retired, and he was interested in coming up, and he was concerned about the weather, concerned about the fishing, the bugs, and bears. And I said, look, the weather is what it is, the fishing, it is what it is. The bugs, I don't think are going to be a problem. The bears, as I've been going up for 40 years, I've never seen a bear, not to worry. Of course, the first night we get up there, we have a bear walk into our camp, and we got him out, and then 15 minutes later, I was cleaning up the dishes, and I turn around, and we both had separate tents, and I see my friend's tent shimmering, and there was the bear inside his tent, which had been open, so it hadn't crashed his way in, tore his way in. So I tell that story because there are no guarantees. But every trip just feels so different. We've had our share of injuries, and we've had our shares of fun and celebration. I mean, some of the more memorable trips I've taken are some of my whitewater trips, only because they felt adventurous, they felt scary, they were challenging in a way that flat water isn't. One of the rivers I used to do is the White that feeds into Lake Superior, and the White's a beautiful river. But the hardest part of the trip was actually the last day, which is when we'd camp at the mouth of Lake Superior, and we had to do the last 3 miles along the lake to the putout. And we had a couple of very harrowing experiences on that lake. That lake can be pretty moody, as you know. And I remember one time the swells were so high, I was in the bow, and at the crest of the bow, I could not touch water with my paddle. And then another time we were taking on water, but we couldn't bail because we needed to keep our paddles in the water to make sure that we didn't go broadside against the waves. Those were a couple of harrowing trips, and having nothing to do with the whitewater.
Well, that's really interesting and scary. Though those big rollers there. Wow, it's
and Lake Superior, as the cliffs, so there's nowhere to land. So you basically have these 3 miles. You just got to paddle. You get there.
No sandy beach to pull up on. Well, there was a couple questions here, and I want to pull on the thread of one of them. So, and go back to a story we touched on. So you went over 20 years ago with 5 students from DeSable up to the Boundary Waters, and it was kind of a mixed experience for the kids. And I want to kind of acknowledge that, and have you just talk about how about that.
No, it was interesting. I heard about these 5 boys from DeSable High School who were going to take an outward bound trip up on the Boundary Waters, and I thought, oh, I'm in for this. It's sort of the intersection of both my passions. And actually, originally I was going to do a story for the New Yorker, and I thought it was going to be this story about these 5 boys finding what I found in the Boundary Waters. And I get up there, and First of all, the kids, they were so anxious. They were so nervous about the trip. It was also the noisiest trip I've ever been on. Those kids could not pipe down. And I realized it was in part, and this is what I talked about earlier, is that their life was so filled with the clutter and noise, cacophonous noise in the city. They were trying to replicate it up in the Boundary Waters. That quietude, which I so love, which you so love, made them uneasy. And I think part of the reason it made them uneasy is because it gave them this space where all these memories. And I realized, I would sometimes talk to the kids individually. One of them, their father had been stabbed, another one had witnessed a murder in the projects. And I came to realize all that was bearing down on them, and that in a place like this where we find such refuge in the silence that Sig Olson talks about, for them it was scary because all these memories came back. And then also too, I just think the sort of unease of it was a particularly bad year for the mosquitoes. The bugs were bad. It rained a fair amount. And so it was a very different kind of trip that I anticipated. I ended up not doing the piece for the New Yorker. I did it for the Sunday magazine of the Chicago Tribune. I didn't stay in touch with the kids. Actually, one of the Outward Bound instructors, Pete Maggio, I'm still very close to. He and I, this is, again, I met him on this trip, and he's now working for the Bureau of Land Management. But yeah, it was a very different kind of trip than I anticipated. Yeah.
And we have a program, No Boundaries for the Boundary Waters, where we connect young people of all backgrounds to the Boundary Waters. And last year we got 130 students out on wilderness canoe trips, and our team here does a great job of trying to get those students ready, for that. And that obviously entails a lot of different things. And I think having a great first experience, there's a lot that goes into it, getting people ready for what they're going to experience. But what you wrote about in that article, Proving Ground, is, there's that mental part too, of just, you mentioned they're replicating their noise, and that cacophony was echoing what they experience every day, and that how silence is so powerful. It can be soothing, but in this case, it was really, really unnerving.
And Chris, to be fair, I think that this kind of tripping, this place like the Boundary Waters, is not for everybody. I mean, I took my wife, before we got married, I took her up to Temagami, which is up north of Toronto, for an 8-day canoe trip, which turned out to be considerably more rugged than I anticipated. We didn't see a soul for 8 days. And that's the last time I've got her on a trip, which is fine. This is sort of my, it's just, so I also recognize that too, that it's just, and it's also the beauty, because otherwise I think the Boundary Waters would be completely overrun if it was for everybody. And I think, and you've seen this, people get up there and they realize, oh my God, what did I get myself into? You see people up there with lawn chairs, see people with their canoes. Sometimes I remember going out one time, these guys went out with a canoe, and it must have been pedaled like 5 feet high, filled with stuff, with a lawn chair on top. And of course, they pulled out on this first lake and went over. We had to go out and help, gather all their stuff for them. But it's not for everybody, and that's okay. I get that.
For sure. And that's one of the great things about freedom and opportunities. You can find what suits you, what's your cup of tea, what's that thing that nourishes your soul and really gives you comfort and inspiration.
But there's nowhere I'd rather be than in the water. I just,
we have a question here, and I invite others to put questions in the Q&A function here. Kind of going back to your Wall Street Journal days here, Alex. What would you say is your most impactful article that you wrote for the Wall Street Journal?
Well, I think the article, the question that got the most response was the story I did on Lafayette the Older, the 2 boys that I ended up writing about. There are no children here. It was just about a summer in his life. And the paper was just deluged with letters. We even got the New York Times op-ed page, the editorial pages even wrote about this piece in the journal. I think that was probably the most impactful. There are other stories from me that are equally memorable, but it was certainly the story that got the most response. And I will say that one of the things I loved about working at the Wall Street Journal, and I wish I could replicate, is I was reaching this audience, mostly business people, politicians, some leaders that I have a hard time reaching today, especially given how polarized we are. And one of the things that was really rewarding about writing for the journal is I would hear from people on the other side of the political spectrum who had their worldview challenged, had their assumptions challenged. And that's the beauty of storytelling. But it's getting harder and harder now to find those audiences.
Yeah, it's so true. This sort of balkanization of the media landscape, where we're kind of all these different segments, and never the two shall meet, is really an issue. And with our organization, as we work on our advocacy work that we've done now for nearly 50 years to protect the boundary waters, it's a fragmented communication landscape where we have to deal with social media, our website, print media, traditional media. It's a really that communicating is such a challenge to try to get the word out and try to get to people who make a difference, decision makers. Whether it's a real challenge, and that fragmentation. There's sort of a bit of fraying of community. We're kind of more of a salad bowl than a melting pot, really, here.
It's getting harder.
Some of you've worked in different media, radio. You've done television with the Interrupter series and print that we've been talking about here. Do you have a favorite medium, or do you like
in the end, my home is print. There's no question about it. And I feel like in the end, print kind of trumps everything else because you can do so much in print. But I especially love working in audio. There is a real power to it, and there are, like the story I did on the kind of audio diary of my trip to the Boundary Waters. I would have had a hard time doing that in print. I mean, the beauty of that is audio. There's something incredibly visceral and intimate, immediately intimate about audio. I find film, when it's working, it can be incredibly powerful. I find it really difficult. It's cumbersome. You've got a number of people out there when you're out reporting. It's got to be operating on all cylinders. I love film. It reaches people that you might not reach in print. But I think my real home is print, but I do have a special place in my heart for audio. And I think some of the best nonfiction storytelling taking place today is happening in audio and podcasts.
Yeah, that is maybe a side benefit of that balkanization. You have this creative outlet that's kind of new with the podcasting that's really brought so much talent to bear. So many great communicators that are working in that space.
Right. No, it's an incredible outlet. And I think I talked about you. I mean, one of my dreams, and I don't know if I'll ever get to it, but I had this idea of trying to spend a summer where I would bring unlikely people up to the Boundary Waters for a trip, writers and artists, politicians, business people, and with each of them just have a kind of conversation and let it be could be about their work, could be about the space we're in, could be about something else entirely, and just to do this kind of audio series of conversations on the water.
Alex, I very much like that idea, to see what creative or other sparks can arise from that when you give people space and an opportunity in that sort of environment to really explore and to think and have that. I hate to use the word synergy. It sounds so it's so cliche and appropriated, but those sparks that can happen in the best sense when you bring people together, give them space, and don't have really a set agenda like that.
Yeah, and you don't have any, just again, there's no distractions. You're so in the moment. And part of it too is I would want to bring people who don't necessarily have a connection to the wilderness, you know, who's
Well, yeah, it's now the first day of November, so you have time to plan. Get that group together. And we can keep that conversation going, Alex, and get ready for permit day in the last week of January here. We can
make sure you get in at 9 o'clock though. I've learned my lesson.
for sure. Well, you know, Alex, you know, I've been an admirer of yours from a distance for a very long time, and it's been great to have this conversation with you to talk about your writing, your experience in the boundary waters, and the intersectionality of that, and some of these themes of empathy and community and listening. I'm gonna bring this to a close here, and I want to draw people's attention to we now have a match going on. We are a nonprofit, and the strength of our organization are supporters such as all of you watching. And we have a Give to the Max Day challenge. Give to the Max Day is November 16th. And we have a match of $176,000 that we're hoping to double with your gifts. We were founded in 1976, and so our match is a little bit of a play on that. For those of you that are in the Twin Cities, the day before Give to the Max on November 15th, we're going to have a Boundary Waters trivia contest at Lake Monster Brewery here in St. Paul. So I hope that you can join us for that fun preview to Give to the Max Day with some Boundary Waters trivia, and then please give to us on Give to the Max Day here. So Alex, thank you. We'll have to talk about some crooked trips up there, planning for next year. I'm trying to get
Chris, you have to let me know next time you're in Chicago, because I remember our first coffee very well when you brought all these Fisher maps with you, and you won my heart right away. So anytime.
Oh yeah, we'll bring all the maps to kind of draw on there where are the good fishing holes and things like that. And well, thank you, Alex, and again, thank you to all the participants here watching. Again, you're the strength of the friends, and we're grateful to have all of you. Have a great afternoon, Alex, and everyone else. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for all your good work. Thanks.